I request Professor Noble to stay on for this last session for the day. And along with her, I also invite medical imaging lead at Caring, Dr. Vasantha. He is truly passionate about improving patient outcomes by integrating technology into the clinical workflow. Welcome, sir. Over to you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. I switch hats, I switch roles into the final session. I think I was going to start this session. So we don't have all our speakers actually, do we, by the look of it?
So I see Dr. Krithika is there.
I think we have
a
Chen, are you going to join us?
Yep, hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah,
right.
That's why I get home. Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. We'll do a little bit of introduction. This last session is going to be the hardest one because all the other panels have nibbled at some of the things we were going to talk about. So it's our responsibility to try and pull some things together. So what we were asked to consider, and I think it sort of nicely rounds off the day as well, what we've heard a lot about at the beginning of study design and some really important factors to consider in how you design a study. We've skipped over the algorithms, which is a shame because that's the area I work in, but it's very appropriate for today. We've assumed our algorithms do a great job. We want to evaluate them, and we've had a nice discussion about evaluation. And what we've just been hearing about are some thoughts about when the algorithms have been translated into practice, some thoughts about how they're being accepted today, and some thoughts on in the future. So what this final panel today is building on some of the discussions we've had today. And specifically, what we wanted to do was to have a discussion about to maybe come up with a list of thoughts, recommendations of things that should be reported and discussed if you were writing papers, if you were reporting on the work that you've been doing on AI, particularly focusing on making sure the work is easily reproducible and that models might be usable. And we've heard a little bit about this before. If I can just go, what I thought I was going to do now is if I can just go back to my screen, is I've just got a few slides that I was going to present just to sort of set us in the that focus for our discussion. I need to go to here. I think it's that. So why is it important to have a discussion about these sorts of issues now? Paula Diamond actually spoke on some of this earlier. As we know, deep learning, which underpins what we talk about AI in as it's used in medical imaging, it's an emerging field, but it's maturing. And although the people do, if you look at the reviews, start to talk about the pros and cons of some of the work that's been going out, the evaluation that's been done, a lot of that, from my perspective, I see that is the field is just emerging, and it's right to have the conversations now. And it's less that people have been really doing things wrong deliberately, it's just where the discussions are now. So the sorts of things you'll hear clinicians talk about are, do we trust AI? Don't we need to understand the black box? You get regulatory discussions. Does an algorithm system do what it says on the can? That's what they worry about. And then the other aspect we've not really talked about today, except slightly at the beginning, is open science, which argues that shouldn't everything be open and transparent, and that means the data, the code, and everything in the paper very, very clear. So the emerging response, which has been touched on in the keynote, was we're starting to see checklists, the guidelines, and these are coming from different perspectives, from the different stakeholders. the machine learning research perspective, one of the big conferences is called MICI. They now, if you write a paper, you have to say that you've cross-referenced to the MICI checklist. The clinical research perspectives, we're now seeing the journal checklist if you want to submit papers. And from the regulatory perspective, the FDA are now have some rules for AI-enabled devices. And again, that's in each case, these are all evolving. So the stakeholders very much recognise that these are important areas. So why are we having this discussion now as a big field? And of course, it's a very interdisciplinary field. Human users of AI-based technology traditionally have been a bit suspicious, and they feel that they need to understand, particularly if these clinical decisions being automated. We've touched on that in the last panel. You've got the regulatory authorities worried that the technologies are sensitive to what are called domain shifts. So that means if they've been developed on certain data, when they are used in practice, the machines might be from a different manufacturer, for example, and the data might appear in different ways. But the reality is, if we go back and look at the technology, these models are complex. They're difficult to describe their completeness because they're expressed through optimization methods, and they are quite often sensitive to these domain shifts. The difference in the data that you're testing on, you might get a different, might be different than the data you've trained it on. So what we also know, and we've heard about this, is that validation methods in papers are not particularly rigorous, and that's also what's changing. So I think going back to it, the field is still in its infancy. We need to think about some of the issues, such as having better clinical metrics. And so what we wanted to have in this final session with our panel members is to look at the question is, how can we do better, and to get some of their thoughts on this particular area. So having made that introduction, I'm now going to pass over to my co-host to maybe introduce himself as well.
Sure.
And take things from here. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Noble, for putting together so well. So those points kind of bring upon a lot of questions to the back of my mind. First, to introduce myself, so I'm Vasant. So I'm a radiologist by training. My job, most of my job now involves looking at these AI solutions from a commercial and production perspective, bringing them into a clinical practice. I'm part of Mahajan Imaging, a group of imaging centers in Delhi NCR region. We try to use some of these solutions in our clinical practice. And I'm also the imaging lead for a company called Carpal, which is housed inside Mahajan Imaging, through which we are trying to validate these commercial solutions at scale and deploy them at multiple sites across globes. Our platform, which is called Carpal, is now deployed at several sites in the United States, some in Middle East, and multiple sites in India. So to open the floor, the first and foremost question I always wanted to ask anyone practicing AI or anyone reading the AI in radiology articles is that we all know that every single article out there compares the performance of imaging algorithm with radiologist performance. Is that comparison fair? Mainly because the radiologist in practice would have multiple other data points at her or his disposal, right? One of the important things is the clinical scenario, the time point, what we call as the context of the presentation of the case. But none of these AI algorithms, the commercial or mature AI algorithms, which we have seen so far, take anything other than the image into kind of consideration before throwing out the predictions. So is it fair to compare an algorithm which does only image, which takes only image as an input, with radiologists who in their clinical practice has multiple other inputs to do their reading and their diagnosis? And number two, in a research setting, the same radiologist who in his clinical practice has several things at disposal is asked to make the diagnosis just based on the image. That's where they're going to falter. Even the thought of that, brings us the practicing radiologist that it's difficult to do a prediction on just an image. So that's the first question. Maybe we can start with Dr. Krithika, who is also a practicing radiologist and a good friend of me. We have worked together sometime in the past. So, question to you, Krithika.
Thank you, Dr. Vasant. So, and thank you, Professor Noble, for summarizing the whole thing so well. Yes, I think that's a wonderful question. So I think the idea of how to evaluate the AI algorithm has to come from an intended setting of use. So perhaps the limitation is that we perhaps don't think quite that far when we're building the algorithm. But it's a good idea to start thinking of how do you want to deploy it? Are you going to actually, what you're offering to do? Is it something that you're going to offer as a replacement for the radiologist, which in most cases it's not going to be? And therefore, I think your question is very valid, that we don't want to actually end up comparing it to the radiologist, because that's not the intended setting. There are some settings where, like we were talking about triage in the previous discussion, where you want to look at what if there is no radiologist. You're just looking to triage patients in a setting where radiologists is just not available. And perhaps in a setting like that, it makes sense to compare it with a radiologist, because what you're looking at is what are the kind of accuracies that you're able to hit, so that you can make an informed decision about whether it would actually make for a setting of replacing in some sense the radiologist. But for everything else, it's a good idea to evaluate the algorithm independently and not against the radiologist. Of course, for the reasons you already mentioned, but also because I think what numbers end up hiding is the clinical diversity of things. So even though an algorithm may be as sensitive or as specific, the kind of lesions, the kind of patients it may be missing things in, happens to be very different from what a radiologist does. So, so a direct comparison, I don't believe, is a good idea.
So, Doctor, yeah.
So, first of all, thanks for the opportunity and for the kind introduction. So I completely echo with Dr. Krithika. It entirely depends on this context in which we plan to use that algorithm. And from algorithm development point of view, also we can think of improving such algorithms by incorporating context into it. So we always call prior information, right? So if you think from a Bayesian point of view, there is always prior information. For example, if a person who is a smoker for a long period of time comes and tells you that I saw blood in my cough sputum, right? So in India, most likely the first investigation we order is a chest X-ray, or the first suspicion would be that it might be a tuberculosis. But in Western countries, with the same setting, same symptoms, same person, the most likely diagnosis might be lung cancer. So as humans and clinicians, we always have this prior in our head. And one way to think about is, and it's an active research area to develop these algorithms and how to incorporate this kind of prior information into these algorithms. Of course, algorithm development apart, the main question is it justified to compare AI algorithms with radiologists? That again, I agree, it depends on context. And for example, can I, if I say the question ask the question in different way. So is the algorithm only useful if it is as efficient or as accurate as a radiologist? No, even if the algorithm is not that accurate, we can use such kind of algorithms. For example, in a situation where triaging is needed and we are screening large number of populations where it is just a screening test, and once screened, these people will be again, these X-rays or whatever the report, it will be again seen by radiologist and confirmed. So if the radiologists are not available and they can't screen large number of populations, even if a AI algorithm, if it is not very accurate, as accurate as a radiologist, we can use those kind of algorithms for these kind of situations. So every model, I think, when built with a good following a good set of guidelines of steady design and everything what we have spoken till now, will be useful. But it's just the case of finding that use case scenario and in which exact clinical context we can use that algorithm.
I completely agree with you, Dr. Desiraju. Before we move forward, can you briefly tell about yourselves, what work you are doing currently?
Yeah.
So that all the participants know.
So I had an interdisciplinary background. I did my MBBS from Andhra Medical College in Visakhapatnam. After that, I did a PhD. And in my PhD, I mostly worked with data and learned a lot of statistics and data science programs. And then I did an internship with Xerox Research Center in Bangalore, where I picked up on artificial intelligence and deep learning. Currently, now I am India Wellcome Trust India Alliance Fellow at Translational Health Science Technology Institute, THSTI, and I work with ultrasonographic images and videos, the data collected from Garbhini cohort. So I use ultrasonographic images and videos to predict adverse pregnancy outcomes, as well as to automate some of the measurements, head circumference, femur length, to automate these kind of measurements taking, as discussed in the previous panel. So developing those kind of assistive and predictive AI algorithms.
Excellent, excellent. So I am from my experience, I can say that such tools would be really, really useful for radiologists. The only thing is that how much the regulation, PCP NDT regulation in India is going us to let use that is still a big question. So we'll move on to the third panelist here, Chen. Why don't you introduce yourself, Chen, and then share your thoughts around the AI versus human comparison in radiology AI studies.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. And Alison, I think I like your introduction slides, and this always gives me lots of thoughts. Yeah, I did my PhD study in University College London, working on radar and electronics and machine learning. And later on, Alison introduced me to the healthcare field, that is the ultrasound imaging and machine learning. So I spent like 3 years as a postdoc with Alison, which is a very happy time. And later on, I moved to Beijing as an assistant professor in Peking University, still working on a medical image analysis. So that is my background. I think to answer the beautiful question, I think there are 2 points I want to make. First thing is AI algorithm is not magic. It is just, from my perspective, a very good memory machine. So it just memorize what the annotators think this image looks like, and it just memorize that mapping between the image and any annotations the human made. So from this perspective, I don't think AI can do much better than human, but there are some exceptional cases. For example, AI algorithms can have a better memory, so it can memorize all the patients it has seen. So I think if, say, you want to find out the most similar patient with your current patient, then the AI algorithm may do a very good job. That is a better job than you, because it sees thousands of patients, then it can retrieve the best one. For example, another application is super resolution, right? Say you have a very low resolution image. AI algorithm can reconstruct the high resolution one, but maybe from the human head, you cannot imagine what exactly the detailed structure are there. So since it is like a super memory stuff, I don't think it can reason that well like the human do, especially in your diagnosis. But it could assist you pretty well. I think that's my first point. The second point is like, if it in terms of the evaluation, I think Alison and I did a workshop this year, ISB. So we host that, And in one of the tasks, that is the detection task, I think all the candidate algorithms did very good job. It achieved a very high metric that is like 90% or 92%. But those predicted bounding boxes are not cannot get agreement with the clinicians. So the metrics are there, but it probably is not suitable for the task. I think when we compare between AI algorithms and the radiologists or the clinicians, we need to have like a performance metric that is fair for the evaluation in the correct context. I think those are 2 points I want to make. Thanks.
I completely agree with you, Chen. Especially, in fact, we have worked on this quite extensively, where at label level, the predictions are right. But once you go and see the explainability outputs which the algorithm has produced, it doesn't match with what the clinician expects the lesion to be. We call this as clinical explainability factor, or CEF. We also have a way to calculate this. If we use this greedy matching algorithm, which matches the bounding box by the ground truthers, and the AI outputs maps, and whichever fails, then a clinician looks into that to understand if there is any other explanation which he can probably offer. So it's a work in detail. Maybe I will share that link with everyone in the chat box so that you can go through it. I will pass on the baton to Alison for the next question.
Thank you. So if we go back to our original sort of question, it was to do with how do we ensure things are transparent, reproducibility. If you like, our sister field, if you work in medical image analysis, would be computer vision. And that's where deep learning has really started out in imaging. And they've made, part of the success has been because they've posed challenges, and in grand challenges, which means is have large data sets on which people can benchmark algorithms. And this idea has also started to appear as a way to do evaluation in medical imaging as well. So Chen, you touched on your experience of trying to organise one of these so-called grand challenges. So could you comment on what do you see as the role of the grand challenges, and also maybe what are some of the limitations as a way to help us look at reproducibility and the transparency of reporting?
Okay, sure. Thanks for the question. Yes, we did hold a workshop, a challenge, and I think the role of the grand challenge is more like an open area that posed some interesting unsolved clinical questions, and to see how the current algorithm status is to solve those clinical or medical image analysis problems. I think from my analysis, most of them now are machine learning problems now. It's not really the image processing or image analysis problems. So one of the point is like machine learning algorithm currently dominates this grand challenge, but I don't think that should be the only part. So some data, maybe we have like small data. For example, in our second task, we only have 80 image to train and a test on 20 image. I think that is a very hard task. And to solve those small data task, our winner actually does not use any machine learning method. It just used a single image processing methods to get those labels and then get more augmented data to train. So I think that one of the direction maybe the grand challenge did is it could direct the research community to a direction that is the popular one. But I don't think that should be the only one. And that's my first point. The second point is more like in the grand challenge, we host our data there, and we want to try to evaluate or to see what are the current state-of-the-art method did. But the evaluation metrics, I think we hesitate a lot when we choose the best evaluation metric, because there are also hyperparameters to tune the metric. For example, whether we use 0.5 or 0.6, and choosing different metric parameters will give different ranking leaderboards of those algorithms. So it is very important to let the community know how sensitive those algorithms are to those predefined metrics. And also the next question is whether the metrics is the good one to meet the clinical utility. I think those are my comments. I may miss a lot, so Alice, you may want to.
Well, I think another point, both from that challenge and we have run one before, is if you pose these two computer science groups, because they don't have the clinical context, they don't always approach solving the problem in a way a group who worked with a clinical group would. And I think, to me, what's really highlighted to me is that the importance of working in interdisciplinary teams when you work in this space, to really be able to then solve the correct or as close to as you can to the correct problem, rather than maybe come up with a solution to something that you think you can solve. And that, I think, some of the challenges that you see, and if anybody's interested in challenges, a lot of them are hosted on one website that we could provide afterwards. But they have provided a great way to benchmark. And also, I think the other thing is bring communities together of people who are working on solving a certain problem. And that's clearly important as well, to not just get one group trying to solve a problem, but try and create a community to really advancing how you can solve certain problems in certain areas as well. Do any of our other panel members want to comment, or do they have experiences?
Yes, I'd just like to add to that, which is, I think it's also very good in the sense that since you're all sort of using the same data to also test it on, and often the testing data, at least a part of it, is not available to the participants when they actually submit their entries. I think that makes for an excellent way of sort of standardizing the outputs, which perhaps is something that we can look at doing even when, say, a company comes to a hospital, for example. So if we were approached by multiple companies claiming to do the same thing, I think this idea from Grand Challenges is kind of very useful if you can have sort of a held out data set which the companies don't have access to. Then it becomes a very standard way of actually looking at what algorithms work and what algorithms do not. And the only problem, I think, with Grand Challenges is really the approach that most of the researchers take, in the sense of looking at it more as lesser as a medical problem, but more as a machine learning problem. So I think the attempt kind of ends up getting hijacked towards that end. But other than that, I think it does actually provide a lot of data. So even for researchers who are starting off, who do not have access to a lot of medical data, it's a great way to start. And even for problems practically that we end up solving, they actually provide open data sets which you could pre-train on and then sort of move forward, or just test on when you're reporting your results eventually. So in that sense, I think, yeah, it does have a lot to add, although it may not be the only thing, like Chair mentioned.
Correct.
Yeah. Kundi.
One more thing I'd like to add is sometimes, as a group, we are working on a problem for a long time and we are thinking about it continuously, and we tend to get stuck in that loop of thinking, and we get stuck in that loop. And these kind of Grand Challenges and everything open up a fresh perspective. We can get a fresh perspective from the participants, fresh ideas, innovative ideas. And from that point of view also, I think these kind of things will be of great help, and it will be a good learning as well.
Excellent points by every one of them. Especially I agree with Krithika's point. The challenges offer a way to how do we test these algorithms in clinical practice. But that's always an interesting conversation, right? The challenges are loved by academics, but industry doesn't seem to kind of care about these challenges because, as far as I remember, no mature commercial product would have ever come out of a challenge. And the data set which are released with the challenges are, again, have a lot of ifs and buts. You can't develop commercial solutions out of that. So many ifs and buts, but still it's a interesting concept which academics love. And taking from the same theme, when the companies publish these results, the amazing outstanding results comparing with radios and other things, there is always this continuous call from academia, and that the code, the data, everything should be made open source. Does that even sound fair? Is it fair? Is it needed? And sub question to that is, even if the code is released, the data set is released, right? It's going to be probably without weights. How does radiologists, say in a secondary or tertiary care center, use that without a platform to access that code, platform to integrate that code with this clinical practice? How is it going to benefit the medical community or the downstream healthcare service provider? It's definitely going to benefit the academic community. It can initiate a lot of academic conversation. Is it going to be really useful for healthcare providers? It's an open question. Anyone can kind of take it up. I have made it as much controversial as possible because I see a lot of academic participants in this panel. So please go ahead and take it up.
Yeah. I'll go first. So I completely agree with you. So what any model is intended to be used, right? And especially in AI in healthcare. So development of the model is only the start. So there is a translational pipeline and development is at the leftmost. And the next step in this pipeline is reporting of the model, which is we publish, and we tell the world about it that we have developed this model and this, and followed by validation and a proper external validation. So what I feel is this reporting should automatically facilitate that external validation. So whatever we are reporting, so here, if we see the people who can validate and who are seeing patients, so the intended user is a practicing physician, right? Ultimately. So I think we should make it easy for that person to take up the model and just validate it. And while, as you rightly pointed out, publishing data, algorithms, and annotations, all these things is also important. What I feel is there should be a database or some repository where people can actually submit those models. So for example, if we do any high throughput biology experiment like transcriptomics or some kind of metabolomics, there are certain repositories, and unless you deposit the data set in those repositories and provide the ID, the journals are not accepting the publication. So what I feel is to enable this translation pipeline, submitting the models as they are will be very important. If they can develop it like a software or very easy implementation for a clinician, that would be even great. But at least submitting the model object along with weights and everything would be the right start, I would say.
So won't you feel that it will kill industry participation, because huge amount of investment goes into kind of sourcing data, getting annotations, training resources, and that's their IP, right? That code is the IP of a company which has got invested millions and millions of dollars into that, making that product. So is it fair to expect them to release that and compromise their IP, even though it can be protected and so on, but still there is a inherent risk which can kill their company? So is it fair to expect them to take that risk?
No. So if you are asking me, it's not fair. But as I said, either a model object or a tool, perhaps. So until the tool is properly validated by externally by several clinical people or clinical researchers and whoever the stakeholders are, they can probably make the tool open source and let people do validation studies, proper external validation, and then you might cut off the access to that tool and then incorporate these models in the softwares that they are selling. But I really feel that kind of external validation should be there. And Dr. Paula also pointed out a lot of loopholes in these kind of validation pipelines, and she has given a very nice talk. So I feel that that step should happen.
I think one of the arguments, this is whether you which side of the fence you sit on for it. One of the arguments relates to the fact these models have been built by health data, and that you could also reverse the model and recover information about a patient. So that's certainly an argument that's presented as to why you wouldn't release health-based AI models. So does anybody have comments on that? And that really it's a different category. It's a different category because of the sensitivity of the data on which you built the model. So any thoughts on that? Kundi, as you were one, any thoughts on that one?
Yes, so I'll follow up on what Koundinya actually just pointed out. I think as an academician, I have to say I love the concept of releasing everything. But as Dr. Vasant just mentioned, it is unrealistic to expect a company who wants to survive, and essentially the survival of the company is related to survival of the science as such, because we're not just killing the company, we'll also kill the science altogether if we're not going to give them a way of actually making the most of what they built with all the effort that they put in. Having said that, I think the critical thing, and I think why there's a call to try to release as much information as possible, is because of the data biases which makes deep learning so blind. So so if we don't know what data it was really trained on, we wouldn't know if, for example, that there is, if a certain kind of images were there at all. So where does it actually work and where does it fail is something that we're able to answer only if we know what sort of data it was trained on. Also that in terms of building the model, how much it does matter how the model was built. Was there any medical information that was taken into consideration? What kind of pre-processing was done? Because even just the pre-processing, regardless of the model, actually changes so much about the kind of outputs that we get. So I think it's going to be a fine balance between how much you're willing to, how much information you're willing to part with and how much information you want to keep with yourself. But having said that, I think at least it may not be possible, of course, to release the data. Of course, as Professor Noble pointed out, especially the data is extremely sensitive. This is all patient data and cannot be released. But I think what is essential is at least a detailed description of the data. We need to know medically, what categories the data fell into, even if that's not really the objective of, for example, if you were trying to detect cancers in the breast on mammograms, then you would at least want to know what breast densities you trained on, if not actually release the entire data, so that you know what context it would work in, and you would know that perhaps if it's a dense breast, it may not work. So that kind of a description of the data is extremely essential, and I would personally imagine that at least a description of the network is also actually essential, even if you're not completely actually releasing the network and the trained weights. But at least you need to describe how you decided to go ahead and train it, which is something we face when we actually get startups or other companies approaching hospitals. They're not willing to give information on the networks at all, which makes it very difficult to actually go ahead and trust it, because we don't know what kind of clinical situations it's actually going to work in.
Okay, I think there's a question from Dr. Mooley. Would you like to, or a comment, would you like to join? If not, we'll carry on.
Molly, would you like to ask your question? Your hand is up.
Great. I just was wondering in all of these sessions whether we touched upon health equity and how to keep this secular. In a lot of contexts, what happens is that whenever something that is considered an innovation or something which is state of the art gets in, despite for purpose of regulation and all of those, the fact that it improves access to healthcare for a lot of poor people and for people who do not have access and all of that, invariably the technology first reaches those who already have access to high quality ultrasounds. It's sort of like a toy that first goes to people who already have other toys, and then takes a long while to trickle down. So what do we put in place for such enabling technology to not get monopolized by people who have very little incremental benefit from it? Thank you.
Do any of our panel want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, but I think a lot of technological problems just have some non-technological solutions, and perhaps for this, I think what I completely agree with is that perhaps the biggest beneficiaries of an AI-based technology is people who live in underserved areas where they really have nothing. So I mean, can it actually provide something? Is an important question. Whereas we end up actually comparing it with the most rigorous standards, which actually don't matter for them at all. I mean, it doesn't have to be better than the radiologist to be able to be applicable to a peripheral center which doesn't even have one. So I think perhaps one way of starting to address that is when we're actually evolving such a technology, we need to start thinking of whom it's going to benefit. So when we actually start developing it, if we start developing it with an intent to reach them, then you start designing your studies when you evaluate it, so that it is actually over there. Problem, as I see it, is the business model around it. I mean, so how are you going to make it work, even if you've done that? So I think on paper it sounds very good, but eventually there has to be somebody who says that they would finance it and they would eventually take it to the masses.
So, Dr. Krithika, interesting point. So I'm just trying to present a contrarian viewpoint on, even it was discussed in the last panel also. If there is nothing, any AI is good. Is that even valid? I want to touch upon that. The problem there is, right, do no harm is one of the basic tenets of medicine. And the problem with, applying AI to underserved populations is we all understand that none of these underserved population data sets are part of AI development processes, because they never had these, X-rays, CT scans, MRIs done in the first place. And their data is not part of the usual training data, which is used to develop these algorithms. And you are trying to deploy the algorithms not developed on representative data from these populations to the same populations, fully knowing that there's going to be a lot of bias, and ready to take that risk of deploying an AI with bias to the population just because they are underserved, and in the way introducing maybe more harm. I'm not sure. I just want to kind of elicit some interesting thought processes on this contrarian view.
That's a very interesting point. So, so the two things on that I would like to say is that one, so for example, in our own setting, if we look at it, say in a government hospital, in a major government hospital, say AIMS, where I come from, the data actually does come from the underserved population. So most of the data that we're using is actually from patients who come all the way from the periphery. So I think it's important to be cognizant.
But AIMS doesn't provide data for training algorithms, commercial algorithms.
It provides us. So yeah, it does when you're doing it yourself. But other than that, yes. No, of course, there are huge problems as far as the data itself is concerned. I completely agree. And but certainly where I agree with you completely is what I definitely did not mean to say is any AI is okay. It has to still go through the same rigorous sort of validation in that particular population that it would have otherwise. And it can definitely do more harm than good. For instance, like if it was again detecting cancer in mammograms, like I mentioned earlier, it's much better to tell a woman that she's not been screened than to tell a woman with cancer that she has no cancer and you send her back. But having said that, providing this as a solution in no way means that it would require lesser rigor in terms of its validation just because it's going to an underserved population. It would still have to go through the same rigor, only that the study needs to be designed a little differently.
Okay, I think it's now time to sum up. So can I invite my co-coordinator to close the session?
Yes, so we had thought of discussing kind of more points, but I think it got so interesting that we could not discuss everything which we thought out. So the three areas which we discussed quite extensively is the first problem of the radiology manuscripts publishing purely comparing human readers, which the panel agrees that it should depend upon the context in which the AI is supposed to be used. If it is going to be used in a triad setting or different settings, it's still okay. But if you are going to use in a prediction setting, a classification problem, typically a context of the presentation should be taken into consideration. That's the consensus number one. The consensus number two is around grant challenges. They definitely agree because there are more academicians in this panel. We have to conclude that they definitely help. At least in that sense that the hospitals and the deployment healthcare provider sites get a fair idea of how to design a validation test set, what should be the validation metrics around which an algorithm should be evaluated properly before unleashing this potential of AI on their clinical data. And the third interesting conversation, was around the releasing data annotations and algorithm and code. Even though again, it may not be feasible for the commercial vendors to release everything, whatever they got, they should be as much transparent as possible, so that the solution which they have built is understood by the users that it's appropriate for their own clinical settings and they can use it as and when needed. So if I missed anything else, please feel free to add.
Thank you. We'll pass back to Topeka now. Thank you.
Yes. Any closing remarks from anyone?
I think Topeka, we hand over to you now. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Noble, and excellent work with the timing. I have to congratulate the coordinators for keeping the time. And thank you for yet another day of engaging lectures and discussions. It's been a great day of learning.